Do you have, is your presentation going to be behind you? Or do you have your laptop? Okay, please come up. So Chris Farmer is with General Catalyst Partners, and he has some very interesting data on venture capital firms and something that he calls investor rank. And I'll let him take it away.
All right. Thank you. Mike and Eric asked me to come speak to a number of you today. A couple of years ago, I left Bessemer Venture Partners because the dynamics of how you funded startups had changed. I took a year to really deconstruct the venture capital industry and the ecosystem around funding startups in order to understand how there were shifts in the market and who were the new emerging players. Part of this was me figuring out kind of what I wanted to do, moving into the next generation and a new way of financing startups. So I ended up doing an extensive research project that interviewed about 500 entrepreneurs, 150 funds, and ended up running the numbers on tens of thousands of companies over the last 15 years. One of the elements of that research I'm going to present to you today. A couple other pieces have been published before in Harvard Business Review and the Journal of Private Equity and Institutional Investor. But wanted to walk through essentially a methodology that we created on how to look at who are the up-and-coming investors in the industry. This is particularly focused on the venture capital funds of $100 million in their current funds and more. So historically, the venture capital landscape has been relatively static. From the PC boom to the internet boom, almost 80% of the firms were the same firms. And what's interesting is the top 50 firms, people have always focused on who are those top firms because they've driven the vast majority of the returns in the industry. In the PC boom, the top 50 firms were 13% of the market and generated about 44% of the returns. In the internet boom, they were only 4% of the market of the number of firms, but they generated about 2/3 of the returns. Today, it skews even more to the top 15 firms. So there's a lot of controversy around who are those top firms, who are the emerging players, because historically, when you look at just simply returns, it's very much looking through the rearview mirror, often delayed 5 or 10 years before you really know the results. So we try to come up with a methodology that effectively gave you a sense of where firms are going and who are the emerging top players. So one of the big reasons for the shift in the market is that the capital requirements for particularly software-driven businesses to launch product has changed dramatically over the last decade. What used to take many millions to launch an initial product can now be done for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. You've seen this disruption through through organizations like Y Combinator, as well as a lot of the product launches here. The companies have not raised substantial amounts of money beforehand, so there's many more options that an entrepreneur has in how they finance their business. So why would an entrepreneur care about, who are the top VCs, who are the up-and-comers, et cetera? Well, it impacts a number of key elements for entrepreneurs. One is the ease of raising follow-on capital, the ability for the VCs themselves to raise more capital and therefore be a strong, viable, long-term partner. It does impact as well the potential turnover of the partners. It's very disruptive to a startup to have one of their board members leave. And if a firm is not performing, it often will increase the probability that that type of thing will happen. And it's also highly correlated with entrepreneur feedback. The firms that entrepreneurs seek out are often the best investors that they can find by reputation. And so they'll often have great experience sets and related experience that the entrepreneur can draw from, and great networks, et cetera. And it is an indication, in essence, of value addition. So how did we do this? We essentially created an algorithm very similar to how PageRank worked, which is a peer review based formula. We wanted to use publicly available information, and we wanted it to be based on objective versus subjective terms. Right? There's a lot of anecdotes and hearsay and whatnot that goes on in the industry, and we wanted to be purely on something that was easily quantitatively verifiable. So we created what we call network centrality, which is in essence looking at who follows you or invests concurrently with you in a particular company. Right? So for example, if I lead an investment in company A and then Sequoia also invest with me or subsequently in that investment. It's in essence the purest form of peer review because they're putting their money where their mouth is, right? If it happens again on company B and then Kleiner Perkins or Andreessen Horowitz or another top firm invests in that, that is yet another peer review. The more consistently that happens across a venture portfolio, the higher the probability or expected outcome of that portfolio. It doesn't count, though, if a top firm invests and then I invest afterwards, because that's a peer review of you to them versus them to you. We used, as far as the data, we used primarily Crunch-based data, but we also added in information from venture capital websites, from PR news releases about financing events, et cetera. And this is data from January 1st, 2006 to the present. So the last 5 years, in essence. And which is actually approximately the current portfolio of many of these funds. So this will be a little controversial, probably, and I may no longer be able to apply for golf membership at the Palo Alto Golf and Country Club. But shockingly, there's been a dramatic shakeup in who are the top investors in the industry and who are getting into the most competitive deals. Number one is a new entrant into the field, which is quite a dramatic shift. And then a few names that are well known and respected over many years. Next would be Union Square Ventures, General Catalyst, and Khosla, several new entrants into the top 10 that were not there before. Now, of course, I now work for General Catalyst, so a lot of people ask the question, well, isn't this a little self-serving? Well, the reality is I actually did this work a couple of years ago, and it was one of the reasons that I joined General Catalyst, because I perceived them to be one of the top up-and-coming funds, not the other way around. And the data speaks for itself. It's a quantitative methodology and is easily verifiable. So this is what the data ends up looking like. If you look at the portfolio where they have co-investors or follow-on investors, the data set for Andreessen Horowitz is relatively small. It's only 22 companies where that happened. And about 40% of the time, a top 10 firm invested with them or after them. Now, some people would look at that and say, well, they've done a number of rounds very late and whatnot. Well, if they were the last investor in and it didn't come with another one of the top investors, that wouldn't be included in this data set, so it wouldn't skew. This actually biases somewhat towards the earlier stage investments where other top players come in as well. But this gives you a sense of how you would look at this, which is very useful because it can be cut by, unlike other methods, which is just purely on a portfolio-wide basis, this can be cut by sector, by partner, by year, and give you a very clear understanding of where the industry is going and how firms are performing. So of the top 6 that have emerged over the last 10 years, there's a number of new entrants into the top 15 that are indicated by just the number of, 2 of them are judges here on the finals, which is an indication of Union Square and first round of the remarkable ascent they've had in the industry, and that's reflected in the data and the respect that they've gotten with entrepreneurs and the success of their portfolios. And then finally, the top 10 consumer VCs. You have, again, several new entrants into the field. This one is actually weighted. It biases towards those that have gone earlier and have the top 10 investors around them. It weights kind of the earlier stage players versus the later stage. But this gives a really clear sense of who are the first movers, who are some of the thought leaders in the investment community. We also wanted to do this for the micro VCs, even though the data is a little more spotty because I don't always include that data, but in the public domain. But we will probably release that in a later presentation if TechCrunch will be interested in that. Anyway, so we will be, as I said, releasing additional information later, and hopefully through TechCrunch. And I also wanted to thank my colleague Nico, who spent countless hours crunching tens of thousands of companies over the last few weeks to make this happen.
So just, you can stay standing. Can you go back to the top 10 slide? I really find this really interesting, top 10 overall, 1 through 10. If you go back 10 years ago,
that's right.
Did you, who would have been, because I look at, you look at Kleiner, they're number 8. 10 years ago, would they have been number 1, number 2?
They certainly would have been one of the top couple.
Yeah. And then you have new entrants like Union Square,
which didn't exist 10 years ago. There were several on here, obviously Andreessen, Union Square, GC, Khosla. None of those existed 10 years ago.
So what this means is that when Andreessen invests, other top firms invest with them or after them more than any other firm.
Correct. They're most consistent that whenever they make an investment across the board, actually in this case 100% of the 22 times when they've made early stage investments that have included a co-investor or follow-on investor, it's been among the top VCs in the industry.
And to what extent is this a predictor of actual returns?
So there's a number of research and pieces of information that show that there's a high correlation between peer review and network centrality and connections between firms and eventual returns. This played out in the late 90s, where there was a strong correlation between the quality of the syndicates and the eventual outcomes in M&A and in IPOs. There's been several academic studies that have been done using the data from a couple of the major limited partners over large periods of time that have shown high correlations between these.
But it's not. But it's just a probability that those will. Anything can happen, right?
Yeah. The industry. Very much these numbers can shift around. One outsized return like a Facebook can drive the ultimate returns very high, but this is more like the probability of something happen about halfway through the race. Because
so do you think Andreessen Horowitz is going to have the best returns out of this lot?
I actually think that Union Square Ventures will probably have the best returns in the industry.
Really? Wow.
But Andreessen Horowitz is tracking unbelievably well. And
why Union and not Andreessen?
Well, Union Square Ventures also has a very small fund. So, and they have a number of major successes in that fund, so I think they will have outsized returns. But I think definitely Andreessen Horowitz will be among the top performers.
Okay, terrific. Well, this is fascinating data.
Great.
Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Cheers.
Okay, that was good. I like that. Okay, if you can welcome this next panel is also I'm very excited about sort of disrupting offline business.